Hello everyone. In today's video, I have a sew along for you. And this one is an appreciation to my private email community. When I made this dress and posted it to my blog last week, I had some technical issues and I put out a call to my community to go and check it out for me. And the sisters showed up for me. So for those of you who answered the call and went to my blog and left comments, thank you so much. This is for you. So we're going to be sewing McCall's 7774, and you can see it here on the screen. First, I'm going to show you the green one that I made in a maxi length. Oh my gosh, I love it so much, and it's very comfortable. If you would like more information about that dress and to see more photos, then you can click the link in the bio. That will take you directly to the blog post. There are lots of photos of both the inside and outside of the garment, close-up photos, and then in different styling options that I've included there. Same thing with the sew along, the dress that I'm going to be sewing today. I have a blog post available where you can go and see close-up photos of the inside and outside of the garment and lots of photos of how I styled it different ways. Okay, now, if you are part of my private email community, then go check your inbox because I left information. If you didn't get it already, hopefully you've already checked your inbox because I did leave I sent that email on Monday so that you could be prepared for this sew along. In the email, I've left all of the information for the pattern, for the fabric options, so that you can be prepared. If you're not part of my private email community, I highly recommend you join. There is a link in the description box below that will take you to the page where you can join. It's free. It doesn't cost you anything except for your email address. And whenever I am going to put out a new sew along or any other videos on my YouTube channel, I like to alert my private email community first. Now, the pattern is rated easy. However, I would not recommend it for new beginners. If you are just learning how to sew and you have not had any time to practice yet, I'm not going to recommend this for you. You can watch the video and follow along and then have something to look forward to when you increase your skills or improve or learn more and add to your skills. But I would hold off on this one. If you are an advanced beginner or above, if you are new to sewing and you've had some practice, you've been working on different skills, if you have gone through my online sewing course, Learn to Sew, Mastering the Basics, you're ready for this. You can do this, especially if you're following along with me in this sew along because I'm walking you through the process from beginning to end. Now, with this sew along, I will not be following the pattern instructions as they are printed. I like to follow my own routine so that I can streamline the sewing process. And then I add extra things in and I don't follow all of their instructions. So as you are following along, if you're looking at your pattern instructions, just know I'm not following in the order that they are following. I like to group all of the like tasks together. If you have not seen my video where I streamline the process, then I'm going to pop up a card for you to go and watch that video, and I'll also link it in the description box where I show you my process. Also, I've made some adjustments to the pattern and I'm going to show you how I did that. For instance, I raised the V on my center front. I raised the armhole height for more coverage, and I also adjusted the pocket piece to make sure that it is anchored to the waist because I don't like to have pockets flapping on the inside of my garment. So we're gonna do that together. And I think that covers it, so let's get started. Today's video is sponsored by Baby Lock, and I will be using my Baby Lock Chorus sewing machine for the project. I will be setting it up for a 2.5 stitch length. I'll also be using my Baby Lock Vibrant Serger to finish off some of the seam allowances. If you are in the market for a new machine and upgrade, I highly recommend Baby Lock. And you can get 10% off by using the code that I'll pop up on the screen, and I'll also link it down in the description box below. Okay, let's take a look at the pattern pieces that we're going to be using to sew view D. First, we have piece number 9, which is used for the skirt front and back. We're going to cut 4 pieces. There is a center front seam and a center back seam. That's why you need 4 pieces. Next, we have the bodice front, piece number 7, and we're going to cut 4. So this bodice is self-lined, so we'll have 2 fronts for the outer shell and 2 fronts for the lining. Then we have the bodice back, piece number 8. Same thing, we're going to cut 4, 2 for the bodice or for the outer shell and 2 for the lining. And finally, we will need piece number 3, the pocket. And you can see that I've made an adjustment to the pattern piece. So go ahead and grab all of your pattern or grab your pocket piece and I'll show you how to make the adjustment right now. Okay, so we have our pocket piece number 3. And as you can see on the skirt piece, we have the circles and the notch. So we're aligning the notch on the pocket piece with the notch on the skirt. And as you can see, the pocket piece doesn't reach up to the waist seam. And that's going to be an issue with the pockets on the inside because after you're done sewing them in, the pockets will flap to the front and the back because they're not anchored to anything other than the side seam. So what I like to do is I like to extend the pocket piece up so that it can be anchored in the waist seam so that it's not flopping around. So I've placed a piece of tracing paper here on top of the pattern piece, and I marked the notch because we want to be able to see the notch. So I'm going to take the pattern piece, the pocket piece, and align that notch, making sure that the pocket piece is even with the edges, the raw edges. And what I'm going to do from here, I'm going to use my styling design ruler, and I'm just going to align it right with this curve. And what's important is that when you reach the top, that you have something that's going to give you an edge to anchor to the waist seam. And then I'm just going to start right on the edge of the pocket piece and draw a line up. And now my pocket piece is curving and coming up. And if you wanted to, you can even make this straighter to give you more of an more width on the pocket edge. Like if you want to freehand it, you can go up. And then when you cut that out, it'll be straighter. And I think this is the one I'm going to go with. This is the absolute best tape to use when you are altering patterns. It's a surgical tape by 3M. I purchased it from Amazon. I will leave a link in the description box. But what I love about it is that not only does it cling nicely to the paper, the pattern, but it's also easy to remove without ripping your paper. And the best part of all is that you can press on top of it and it doesn't shrink or crinkle up when you're pressing on top of it. You know how when you're using regular tape, that magic tape, which is what I used to use, when you press on top of it, it crinkles up and distorts your pattern piece. That doesn't happen with this tape, so I prefer using this. Okay, so we've got that, and you want to make sure that you trace that line. Now we're just going to cut our new pocket piece. And as usual, make sure you're using your paper scissors, not your fabric shears. And this is our new pattern piece. I like to go in the back and cut away the excess tracing paper. And then I will go and tape this down also. And now we have our new pocket piece. So when we align it to the side edge now, align it with the notch. And now when we sew it in, it will be anchored to the waist seam. To shorten the skirt on view D, I'm just using a ruler. You can use a yardstick or a tape measure. And I used the view C line. So this is the cutting line for view C. And I used that line just to measure down. And I cut off 12 inches from the bottom. So I just measured from view C down to 12 all the way around. So I placed the ruler and then made little marks as I moved the ruler. And then I went in and cut along the new line. And then for the bodices, the bodice front and the bodice back, I'll start with the bodice front. I placed tracing paper behind just like I did for the pocket piece, and I used my style design ruler. First, I measured up 1 inch. I measured up 1 inch from the edge of the armhole opening. I measured up 1 inch, and then I marked onto my tracing paper. I marked over 5/8 of an inch. And then from there, I used my style design ruler, and I just positioned it to where it would give me the curve. Now, I wanted to make sure that I was raising it all the way around and then blending it into the previous line. Okay, so you will just take your style design ruler and play around with it, position it to where you will get the curve that you want. Okay, and then trace that, cut it out, and you have your new armhole opening. And then for the center front V, I wanted to raise mine by 1 inch. So my cutting line is a size 10. So I used the 10 bubble and I measured up 1 inch from that bubble. And then I made a marking. Actually, I didn't make a marking. I just used my tracing wheel and tracing paper to trace it onto the fabric, but you can mark your pattern piece. And then for the bodice back, I did the same thing. I measured up 1 inch, used my curve ruler to get the curve that I wanted. And the most important thing that you need to test before you cut out your fabric is you want to make sure that those sides are the same length. So after you make your alteration, put these pieces together, and you want it to be even so that when you are sewing those seams together, you get everything lining up. Okay, before we get started, I want to show you something that I did with my pattern pieces or my fabric pieces, because I'm working with a linen fabric which frays easily. And also because when we sew the zipper in the back, I want a clean finish because I'm going to be pressing the seam allowances open. I finished the raw edges of all of my pieces for the skirt and the pockets using my serger. Now, if you choose to do this and you don't have a serger, you can use your pinking shears, which will reduce the amount of fraying on the edges while you're constructing your dress. So here you can see just around the raw edges, I finished that off. And then also on both sides, the bottom and the top or the waist, I finished off the seam allowances on all 4 skirt pieces. Now, I did not finish the edges for the bodice because it's fully lined. And so those seams will not be exposed, and I will not be handling these too much or until it's time to start constructing the bodice. So I'm not worried about that. Okay? And then for our notions, I have my zipper. We're using an invisible zipper. I'm going to be using a size 80-12 universal needle because I'm working with light to mid-weight linen fabric. You need to choose a needle to accommodate the type and weight of fabric that you will be using. And then I have the hook and eye or the hook and bar. So here is the hook, and you can either use the eye or the bar. Okay, we're going to start with the bodice front. And keep in mind, whatever you do to the bodice pieces, the outer shell, you're going to need to do the same thing to the lining. I'm only going to demonstrate the outer shell. So here you see I've pinned the center front and the darts. Okay, I just wanted you to see what that looks like. Let's bring over center front. And here I've already pinned the center front, keeping in mind that we have the marking here where we're going to stop our stitching. So now we'll go ahead and pin the dart. I'm starting at the dart point. And then we'll go down and match the dart legs on the bottom edge. And just continue pinning that out. Okay, and then you will do the same thing to the other side. Now we're going to make sure that you pin the center back on both your lining and your outer shell. We're going to get all of our pinning for our main pieces first before we go to the machine. Now I have the skirt back, and I've pinned the center back, and then I've already pinned the pockets to the side edges. So we have our skirt front and the skirt back. We have our bodice back pieces, and we have our bodice front pieces. Okay, so we're going to start with the bodice front. We're going to go to the machine, and we're going to start stitching from the bottom edge of the center front all the way up to the marking. Then we're going to back stitch. Then we're going to change our stitch length to a basting stitch, and then we're going to continue sewing up to the edge. And the only reason I'm doing that is just to create a fold line, because when we go to the pressing station, we're going to press that open. We're going to sew the darts starting at the edge all the way up to the dart point. And on those last few stitches, you want to try to sew as close to that folded edge as possible, parallel to the folded edge. And that's what helps to give you a nice smooth transition into the rest of the garment so that you don't have that sharp point. Next, you're going to sew your center back seam from the bottom edge all the way up to the top on both your outer shell and the lining. Next, you're going to take your skirt front and you're going to sew from the bottom edge all the way up to the top and back stitch. Then you're going to take your skirt back and sew from the bottom edge all the way up to that marking. Then you will back stitch. Then you will switch your stitch length to a basting stitch and continue sewing all the way up to the top edge of the skirt. Now we're going to sew the pockets onto the sides of the skirt. You're going to use a 3/8 inch seam allowance, so make sure you change that. And starting at the bottom of the pocket, sew all the way up to the top edge. And you want to do that for all 4 pocket pieces. Then we're going to go to the pressing station, and we're going to start with our skirt pieces. We're going to press the seam allowance, the center front and the center back seam allowance. First, we're going to press it flat, and then we're going to press the seam allowance open. Then we're going to press our pocket seam allowance flat. And then we're going to open it out and press the seam allowance toward the pocket. And you will do that with all 4 pockets. Next, we're going to press our center back seam on the bodice flat and then press it open. Do that for your outer shell and the lining. Next, we're going to press the center front flat and then press the seam open. Next, we're going to press the darts. And I'm going to be using my tailor's hem, but if you don't have one, it's okay. You can just press right on your ironing board. So we're going to press the dart flat. Then we're going to open it out, and I'm positioning it on my tailor's hem so that the point is pointing down on the curved edge of the tailor's hem. And we're going to press that to one side. Okay, now we're ready to put the pieces together. First, we're going to take our skirt front and skirt back and place them on top of each other with the right side spacing. And then we're going to pin along the edge. I'm going to start right here where the pockets meet because we want to make sure that that is aligned properly. So you want to make sure that the pocket edges meet together. And then I'll go down to the bottom. Along the side. Then I'm going to go up to the top. And I'm going to make sure that the raw edges are even. But I like to also make sure that the seam where the pocket and the edge of the skirt meet, I want to make sure that that seam is even also. You don't have to do that. It's just something that I like to do. So I'm going to pin that. And then we'll go around and pin the pocket. And you have a notch at the bottom of your pocket. You can go ahead and pin that. All right. Now, let's put that aside, and we're going to pin our bodice. So we have the bodice front here, or the bodice, or one bodice with the back and the front. So I've already pinned one side, And then we'll just go ahead and pin the other side, making sure that the bottom and the top edge are even. Okay, so you want to do that for both the outer shell and the lining. We're going to go to the sewing machine, and for both bodices we're going to sew from the bottom edge all the way up to the top. Then we're going to sew the skirt front and back together on the sides. So we're starting at the bottom edge of the skirt, and we're going to sew all the way up to this first marking. Then we will back stitch and break the stitching. Then we're going to move the skirt up to that next marking. And we're going to start stitching with a back stitch from that point all the way up to the top edge of the skirt, ending with a back stitch. Now we're going to sew the pockets together, and we're going to go back to that first marking, and we're going to start right there at the seam, and we're going to sew all the way around the pocket up to the top edge. Now we're going to go to the pressing station. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to clip the seam allowance on the back skirt only, right at the corner where that pocket ends. And that's going to release the seam allowance so that we can fold the pocket toward the front of the skirt. Then we're going to press the seam allowance below the pocket open. Next, we will press the seam allowances on the sides of the bodice, press them flat, and then press them open. Okay, now that we have our skirt prepared, we're going to go ahead and pin the pocket at the waist toward the front, the skirt front. Okay, so here we're looking at the skirt front, and we have the pocket turned toward the front, and we want to align, open that out, and align the raw edge of the pocket with the edge of the skirt, and we're going to pin that in place. Okay, now let's open up the center back seam, and I'm going to go from the back, and I have my seam ripper turned away from the fabric. Rather than going this way, I'm going to go this way. I just feel safer knowing that I'm not going to cut into my fabric when I go in the opposite direction. And when you're seam ripping, please make sure that you're always using a very sharp seam ripper. If it's dull, throw it away and start with a new one. Well, you should be able to just tap the thread and have it open up without having to push, okay? That's the end of my basting stitch. All right, we're gonna also open up the back on the bodice. So here you can see on this one, I've already opened up the back, and we have that fold to guide us when we're sewing in our invisible zipper. That's why I like to baste the seam closed. Now we're going to take our skirt to the sewing machine, and we're going to insert a row or 2 rows of basting stitches from one end all the way around to the other end, starting the first basting stitch at the 5/8 inch seam line. And then we'll sew the second row about 1/4 inch in from that 5/8 inch mark, or 1/2 inch on the 1/2 inch seam allowance line. And while we're at the sewing machine, we're going to insert a basting stitch on the bottom edge of the bodice lining at the 5/8 inch mark. And we're going to use that as a guide for pressing over the hem allowance on the lining. Okay, we have our basting stitches at the waist of the skirt. Now we're ready to attach the bodice to the skirt. I'm going to take the right side of the bodice and place it on the skirt. So I have the center front seam on the bodice against the center front seam on the skirt, and we're going to pin. And I'm going to pin right through that seam on the front and the back, and that will help to assure that when we're sewing, those 2 seams will line up. Okay, then we're going to take the fold on the skirt and the fold on the bodice, and we're going to line those up. And I just pin right there on the fold. Okay, I'll do that on both sides. And then we're going to pin the side seam on the up from the bodice, the side seam of the bodice to the side seam of the skirt. And again, I'm making sure that that pin is going into that seam on both pieces. And we're doing the same thing on the other side. Okay, Now you can go in between and pin the notches together on both pieces. Okay, now we're ready to start gathering. So I'm going to turn this over to where the skirt is facing me. And I'm going to start with one side, one end, and I'm pulling the two gathering threads on the side of the skirt that's facing me. And I'm just going to pull and then use my fingers to move the gathers over. And as I get to this pin, I'm going to keep pushing the gathers over. If you're working with a lightweight fabric, the gathers will go across the pin a lot easier than if you're working with a linen or heavier weight fabric. But just be patient. Okay, so you see they're bunched up there, and I'm going to pull to where the gathers are going to just go right past that pin and continue over to the rest of the skirt. Okay, so we're going to continue gathering all the way to the other side of the skirt. And once you have gathered, then you're going to play around with or in between the two pins to make sure that everything or that the skirt is fitting in with the bodice. So let's pretend I'm all done. And then I'm going to go back in between these two pins and I'm going to use my fingers to distribute the gathers so that the skirt fits in with the bodice. And sometimes that means you're going to have to pull it open and release the gathers a bit just so that you get a good fit. And so I still need a little bit more. So I'm going to pull it and then continue distributing the gathers just in that section until it's nice and even. It may not be perfect, but even enough. And so I'm satisfied with that. And at that point, I will go ahead and pin in that section. And you will use more pins for this because you want to make sure that everything stays put when you go to the sewing machine. Okay, so I've pinned in that section, and then I will go ahead and work on all the other sections. Okay, I'm all done pinning the skirt to the bodice, and you can see I used a lot of pins. And as I was gathering, because I'm using a thicker fabric this time, I pulled from both directions. So I pulled from this side or from this end all the way over to the center front, just taking my time. And then I pulled from this end all the way over to the center front. And when you get to, if you're using a thicker fabric, when you get to the pockets, that's what's going to take the most time because of all of the layers and the bulk in that area. But as you can see, it worked out just fine where my pockets are right here, and it's still gathered. Okay. So now we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew from one end all the way around to the other, and I'll be placing the gathered side of the skirt with the gathers face down on the machine. And as you're sewing, if you notice that the top layer, the bodice, starts to begin to create a fold, just allow the feed dog to pull that fabric through so you get a grip on that fabric and allow it to pull and straighten out. Okay, we have the bodice attached to the skirt. Now it's time to insert our invisible zipper. So I have the dress with the wrong side facing out. I'm taking my zipper and I'm placing it with the right side facing down. So the right side of the zipper is facing the right side of the garment that is folded inside. Okay? And I'm going to start pinning at the bottom. And I'm going to move this out of the way. And I'm taking the zipper teeth and I'm placing the teeth on the fold of the dress. And you want to leave a little extra room here. You don't want to start pinning, or actually you can start pinning here at the end, but we're only going to sew to about an inch within the zipper pull because we're going to need some room to flip that out. So with your zipper pull right here on the edge, you're going to open out the dress and place those teeth right along the fold and pin. I like to pin in the direction of the top of the garment, and once I push the pins in, I will push it back down because when I'm sewing, I want to be able to pull the pins out without poking myself. And just continue pinning along the full length. Okay, we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch using our zipper foot from the top of the dress all the way down to within an inch of the zipper pull. Okay, we have one side of the zipper installed. Now we're going to sew in the other side. And we want to make sure that we line up the waist seam as best we can. So first we're going to close the zipper. Let me move this pin. We're going to close the zipper. And what I like to do to try and line up that waist seam is I will use my marking pen. This is a disappearing marker. And on the other side of the zipper tape that I'm going to be sewing onto the other side, I'll take this marker and just mark where that seam is. And since I can't see that well enough, I'm going to use my Clover chalk roller and do the same thing. And this one actually works better because it gives me a nice thin line. So when I pin that to the other side, I'll know where that seam, or where the zipper should go to align with the seam. Okay, just a fair warning, this next portion of the zipper installation is out of focus. The screen is blurry. I am so sorry. I didn't realize it until after I had already sewn in the zipper, and I didn't want to go and take it out and re-record. So you're doing the same thing that you did on the other side. I'm just showing you how to make the markings. So just wanted to let you know. Let's continue. And another place that I like to mark is where the stitching will end at the bottom. So I will open this out again like I did at the top. And this is where my stitching ends right here. So I'm going to mark that on the tape so that when I sew the other side, that's where I want the stitching to end. And the reason I like to do that is because I want to make sure that both sides are even where I stop my stitching, so that when I go back to close up this hole, everything is nice and smooth and one side is not buckled. Okay? And then I can make that mark on the seam allowance also. I'm going to open out my zipper. And again, I'm going to place the zipper, this side of the zipper, with the right side facing down onto the seam allowance. And I'm starting where those markings are, and I'm making sure that those lines or those marks align. Making sure that the zipper teeth is placed on the fold of the fabric. And we're going to continue pinning from the bottom all the way up to the top like we did on the other side. And before I continue, I want to go and pin the zipper at the waistline. So I'm going to go ahead and pin on the fold right at that seam where the mark is on the zipper. And then we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew from the top. Down to this marking within an inch of the opening. Okay, we have our zipper installed, and now for the scary part. This is always scary for me because even after you do all of the prep work, you still hope that it's going to line up. So let's go ahead and pull it up. Yes, 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 yes. So that looks good. And then here you can see that the opening is even. One side is not bulking. They're nice and even. So when we close it up, we won't have any bulky or wavy thing going on here. All right, so now we're going to go to the machine and close up this opening. So we're going to start at the bottom of the opening here, and we're going to sew up just past the zipper stop. And when we get close to the zipper stop, we won't be able to sew right along the same stitching line. We're going to sew just a little bit to the back or to the side of that stitching line, as close as we can get. Okay, now it's time to attach the bodice lining, but before we do that, we need to open up this center front. Remember, we basted that together. And again, I'm going to use my seam ripper, pointing it away from the fabric, and open that up. All right, and I've already opened it up on the lining, and we're going to take the lining right side facing down. And we're going to start pinning right on the neckline. I'm going to match the notches. And I'm going to open out the seam allowance and pin right along the crease. I'm going to continue along the seam allowance, pinning on the crease or along the crease, right in that crease. And I'm going to go right down to where the V meets, and I want to make sure that the V's are even. The V on the bodice and the lining, making sure that they're even. And I'm going to open out that seam allowance, and there's a marking there. I want to pin right there, making sure that I'm catching the V on both sides. Okay, and pin. I'm not going to pin this side yet here in this corner because I need to sew this first, but I am going to go ahead and pin the neckline on the other side. Okay, and then we're going to pin the underarm opening. So I'm going to start at that seam, making sure that I'm pinning right in the middle of that seam on both sides. Okay, and I'm going to continue pinning. I'm going to match my notches here. And the marking we have here. Do that on both sides. All right, and then I'm going to continue pinning up to the top. And you will do the same thing on the other side. And then finally, we're going to pin the back neckline on the bodice and the lining. So I'm going to start here on the end at the folds where the zipper tape is, open out the seam allowance, and again pin right in the crease. I'm going to pin right here up to that point or the marking, and I'll add one more pin in the center. And you'll do the same thing on the other side. And before we go to the sewing machine, we're going to go ahead and add a couple of pins here on the V front opening. We're not going to add one down at the point, but we are going to add one here. Okay. Yeah, we'll add one more, making sure that those folds are aligned. Okay, now we're going to go to the sewing machine, and we're going to start on the front neckline. Starting right here where the marking is, we're going to sew all the way around to the fold, the crease. Then we're going to pivot and sew all the way down to where the last pin is at that point. We will back stitch and then cut our thread. Then we're going to go over to the other side of the front neckline and do the same thing. We're going to sew from the marking all the way around the curve over to the crease, pivot the fabric, and then sew all the way down to that point, making sure that you're stopping in the same spot. So this requires really taking your time and checking as you're going and as you get to that point. Next, we're going to sew the back neckline, and we're going to start from the top edge, the shoulder where the marking is, and sew all the way down to the crease where the zipper starts. And then finally, we're going to sew the armhole opening. We're going to start right where that marking is and sew all the way around over to the other marking. And you're beginning and ending with a back stitch. And you'll do that on both sides. Okay, now that we have the lining attached to the bodice, we're going to prepare our necklines and the armhole opening for understitching. So first, we need to trim away half of the seam allowance on the necklines and the armhole opening. I'm starting with the back neckline. I'm just going to trim away half of that. Now, if you have a rotary cutter, it's a lot quicker. So I'm going to switch over to my rotary cutter and continue trimming away the seam allowances. And again, I'm just trimming away half. And then for the V on the front neckline, I'm going to clip into the corners to allow the fabric to relax and open up when we turn it right side out. So we have the two corners, and you can see right here where I'm grabbing it, I need to cut in there to release that tension. So this is what it should look like after you trim or clip into those corners. And now we can trim away half of the seam allowance. Okay, now I'm going to go back in on the neckline and the underarm, and I'm going to clip into the curved areas, and that's going to help give us a nice clean fold when we turn the lining or when we turn the garment right side out. We only need to clip in the curved areas, and I'm clipping about a half an inch, or each clip is about a half an inch apart. Okay, I'll do the same thing on the armhole opening. Just gonna clip right around the curved edge, the curved part. Now we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to understitch. So we're going to open out, I'm going to start on the armhole opening. We're going to open out the bodice, and we're going to start on one end, going in as far as we can. Now we will not be able to understitch the entire armhole opening because we have this closing, or we have this tunnel here. So we're gonna open it out and go in as far as we can. And what we're doing is we are taking our lining and we're turning it out, making sure that the seam allowance is turned toward the lining side of the garment. Okay? And then we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to place it under the needle as far as we can go. And we're going to sew a stitch about 1/16 of an inch, so close to that seam, all the way down, following the curve, over to the other end as far as we can go. We want to do that for both armhole openings. And we're going to do the same thing on the back neckline and on the front neckline. And you will do the same thing at the center front where we have that V opening. After we're done understitching, we're going to go to the pressing station and we're going to give that a nice clean press. Okay, this is where we are so far. I have turned the lining to the inside of the bodice. Now we're going to sew the shoulder seams together. So we're going to take one side, we're going to open out the front shoulder seam and the back shoulder seam with the right sides facing each other. And we want to make sure that first we align the seam, okay? And then we're going to pin And we will continue pinning over to the edge on both sides. And after we've pinned, we will go to the sewing machine and we will stitch the shoulder seam from one end over to the other. Then we're going to go to the pressing station, and first we will trim the seam allowance. Then we will press that seam flat, then open it out and press the seam toward the bodice back. And after you're done pressing the seam toward the back, we're going to take the remaining raw edges on each side of the shoulder and we're going to press that in, blending it in with the previous finished edge. Okay, we're down to the final steps of finishing our dress. The last thing that we need to do is to pin the bodice to the lining along the center back zipper and along the waist seam because we're going to do some hand stitching. So you can take your pins and just pin that, pin the lining right along the zipper. And when you get down to the bottom of the lining, you want to make sure that it's covering the waist seam. And then you want to take your hand needle and some thread and just sew in a whip stitch from one end all the way to the other. After you have sewn the lining at the center back zipper, then you're going to do the same thing along the waist seam. So you're going to take the bottom of the bodice, making sure that it's covering the seam, the waist seam, and then you will go and do another whip stitch. And then the last thing to do is to sew in the hem. Now you can either, well, first of all, if you are working with a fabric that grows or something that's not as stable as the linen that I'm using, I would recommend hanging your dress on a dress form or a hanger overnight to let it rest and settle, just in case the fabric does grow. And if that happens, like it did with my green dress, then you will have to play around with the hem to get it even. If you're working with a stable fabric, then you shouldn't have any problems. So after you have allowed your dress to rest and settle overnight and your hem is straight, even if you have to do some adjustments, then what you can do this one of two ways. You can either go to your pressing station and fold over the 5/8 inch hem, press it all the way around, and then take the raw edge and turn it in 1/4 of an inch and press that all the way around, and then go to your sewing machine and sew the hem down along the inner folded edge. Now, I have finished off the raw edge of my skirt with my serger. So I'm just going to fold up a 5/8 inch hem and sew that down all the way around. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have enjoyed this sew along. If so, make sure you hit the like button down below and leave me a comment. I enjoy reading your comments and I do respond. If you are interested in becoming a member of my private email community so that you can be alerted in advance for our next sew along, then there is a link in the description box that says join my community. All right. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.